Well, first thing I would say is that we need to find a way of relaunching radical anti-EU and anti-Euro politics, I think, in Europe. I think it's paradoxical that today, at a time when the European Union is proven to be more damaging and more dangerous than ever, Eurosceptic, especially left Eurosceptic politics, is at an all-time low. Because now what we have is not only do we see the European Union continuing to be very, extremely problematic from an economic and social perspective. So all the problems that we've been criticized, that we've been talking about, that we've been raising about the European Union and the constraints it places on emancipatory politics are still there. We see that in the return of austerity. So now we're going to see more attacks on the welfare state, more attacks on labor. That's already happening. So nothing has changed in that respect. In fact, in many ways, things are getting worse and worse. On top of that, though, we have the European Union that has basically transformed itself into an extended arm of NATO and of the US security state. So now not only are we faced with all the constraints in democratic politics that the European Union entails and the pressures it puts on social and economic welfare policies, we're also in a situation where the European Union is the prime driving force for this proxy war with Russia. It's and acts as an institution that sees it as its obligation of ensuring that all the member states are on board with this policy. So what you have is essentially the European Union kind of fusing itself with NATO, and so becoming not just this antisocial but also this extremely warmongering militaristic organization. As I said, an extended arm of NATO, and this makes the urgency of getting out of this institution, I think, greater than ever before. And as you guys mentioned, yes, I think that there is reason to be optimistic to the extent that, in many ways, never have the times been better, or for national governments in Europe that want to increase their national autonomy and their national sovereignty, been better than they are today, to the extent that doing that at a time of American unipolarity would have been very hard. You're trying to break out of a system for which there really is not even any global alternative. Now we know we live in a very different reality. We live in a de facto already multipolar world in which American and Western hegemony is rapidly shrinking, rapidly diminishing. We've got new global alliances forming, new systems of international cooperation and governments that are coming into being. So potentially the time could not be better, and could not be it could not be better than now to break out from this system, because there's so much out there. There are there's a whole world that is actually much bigger than the so-called collective West, that is trying to build a new way of new forms of international cooperation, new forms of international collaboration. So to remain within this system today, at a time when there is a global alternative that is forming, at a time when the actual material benefits of being within that system are continually eroded, really doesn't make much sense. It makes less sense than ever before. And so and as you guys mentioned, I mean, the international context is in such a flux that we could easily, the system could easily come, collapsing, way much before than we expected to do. So at the very least, we should be ready for when that happens, and that's why I think the kind of cultural work that we are doing, with sessions like this is so important. We got to create a vanguard that is ready to pick up the pieces once the system collapses, which I think it definitely will at some point, hopefully in a not too catastrophic manner, but it is going to collapse at some point, and we should be ready for when it happens.
Hello, everyone. Today we'll be speaking with Thomas Fazi on European politics, the European Union, NATO, and the Ukraine conflict. Thomas Fazi is a writer and columnist for Compact Magazine and Unheard. He writes on the topics of geopolitics, economics, war, and energy. He's written numerous books, and the most recent English language books he's written are The COVID Consensus, The Global Assault on Democracy and the Poor, Critique from the Left, co-authored with Toby Green, and Reclaiming the State, A Progressive Vision of Sovereignty for a Post-Neoliberal World, co-authored with Bill Mitchell. He's also written a book on the European Union and Europe titled The Battle for Europe, How an Elite Hijacked a Continent and How We Can Take It Back. Thanks for joining us, Thomas. We appreciate you coming on. You've recently written on the Ukraine conflict. Could you tell us about that and how the Ukraine conflict has affected European politics and the economy?
Yes, well, first of all, thanks for having me, guys. Yeah, I mean, I think the point is what I try to reflect on in some of the articles that I've written recently. It's trying to understand why the European Union has acted, or European countries more in general have acted the way they have vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because from a kind of realist, rational standpoint, it doesn't really make sense. So, there's this realist school of thought which says that, most states tend to act rationally to increase their advantages, vis-a-vis other countries. They tend to increase their power. They tend to try to increase their wealth and their sovereignty, more in general, at least to protect their sovereignty. And I think if you look at the various at the actors in a conflict, so the US, Russia, Ukraine, and Europe or the European Union, I think when it comes to the US, Russia, and Ukraine, you can see it's not hard to understand what the rationale of those countries are. It's not hard to understand what their goals in the war are, and what they all have a rational. It's not hard to pinpoint a rational motive behind their actions. So I would say the United States is clearly using Ukraine to fight a proxy war against Russia. They want to weaken Russia by Ukraine, using Ukrainians as cannon fodder. That's pretty clear in my view. I think morally it's quite disgusting, but it makes it rationally. It makes sense from a kind of an imperialist standpoint. Russia's stance in the war is also quite clear. I mean, they felt that their sovereignty was threatened by what NATO was doing in Ukraine in the years and months leading up to the conflict, and they intervened to stop in its tracks what they considered to be a risk to their territorial integrity and national security. They didn't want NATO right up at this huge border they have with Ukraine, especially given the you know the rather explicit anti-Russian stance that NATO had already taken by then for some time. So, it's quite clear what they're trying to do in this war. And again, one can agree with it or not, but it makes sense. Ukraine, obviously, sees itself as fighting to, defend itself against Russia. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. But when it comes to the European Union, what does the European Union have to benefit from joining the war in the way it has done? Essentially, kind of just subordinating its policy to US NATO policy and just going along with the proxy war strategy. So America is very far away. So it hasn't really been impacted from a security standpoint by this war. And it hasn't been impacted economically. In fact, it's benefited economically in many respects because now it's selling Europe, Russia. It's selling Europe gas that Europe prior to the war used to get from Russia. So it's actually also had, it's also benefited in quite an obvious direct way economically from this war. And of course, it's benefiting in a number of, at least in the short term, in a number of other ways. First and foremost, boosting NATO that was kind of half dead before this, before the conflict, and really reasserting its control and its hegemony over Europe, which I think is another goal from the US perspective in this war. It's about weakening Russia on the one hand, and it's about reasserting American control over the kind of vassal states of Europe. And I think the first goal of weakening Russia hasn't worked out that well, and isn't working out very well. But the second goal of reasserting control over Europe has definitely worked out very, very well for the US. But what does Europe have to stand to benefit from this war? It's paid a huge price in economic terms by essentially cutting itself off Russian gas and other Russian resources to the point that what used to be Europe's economic powerhouse, Germany, is now effectively has in technical recession. Its industries are struggling enormously. There's open talk of deindustrialization in Germany as more and more businesses and industries are forced to close due to rising energy costs. So it's been an absolute tragedy from an economic standpoint for not just for Germany, but for most of the big European economies. So if you look at industrial production in Europe, it's on a downhill slope, and has been for a long time. So Europe is essentially deindustrializing as a result of this conflict. So there's clearly no direct economic benefit from kind of an economy at large perspective. Of course, there are sectors of the economy that benefit from this situation, i.e. the European military-industrial complex, for example. But from from the perspective of the collective interests of the European nations, as hard as that may be to define, this war has not been beneficial at all. In fact, it's been a tragedy, even though, of course, as always, it's the working classes, it's the middle classes that have paid the highest price. But what we're seeing is also, European capital, big capital, suffering, industrial capital suffering a lot from this war. So this goes beyond a traditional kind of labor capital conflict thing. Pretty much all the sectors, apart from a few, have suffered a lot in this war. And then there is, of course, the even bigger question of the security issue. Like, how does it make sense for Europe to escalate tensions to this level, to the point where there's a real risk of an open talk of the need to prepare for a conventional all-out war with Russia, which could easily escalate into a nuclear war? I mean, this is from a rational standpoint, there is, I mean, there's no way to justify. There's no way to see how this benefits Europe in any way. Europe clearly has a collective interest in trying to avoid war with Russia at any cost. I mean, this isn't rocket science. This isn't, this is like, again, geopolitics 101. You want to avoid a war with Russia, which would obviously have devastating consequences for the continent. Again, America is pretty far away, so it wouldn't be as directly impacted, especially from a conventional war with Russia, as much as Europe would be. Again, this is all pretty obvious. And so the question becomes, why is Europe doing all this when it's the overarching interest, again, the kind of the collective interests, and then you have, various sub-interests. But it's not hard, I think, to make the case that Europe as a whole has a collective interest in renormalizing relations with Russia from an economic standpoint and from a geopolitical standpoint. I think that's pretty straightforward from my perspective. I mean, it makes no sense. I mean, we share thousands and thousands and thousands of kilometers of border with Russia. It's literally our neighbor. The idea that it makes sense to antagonize this massive nuclear-armed neighbor which also happens to have a lot of resources that we would benefit from, really makes no sense whatsoever. And so the question becomes why? And I think there are a number of answers to that question, but I think they can all be kind of brought back to the fundamental question of Europe's progressive loss of sovereignty and autonomy over time. And this is largely a result of the fact that Europe has never been fully autonomous and fully sovereign. I mean, this has been this is part of the idealist post-war narrative, but in fact, Europe has always been in a subordinate position vis-a-vis the US. The US still has thousands of troops stationed in Europe and has ever since World War II. Most notably in the two countries that lost the war, i.e. Germany and Italy, but elsewhere as well. Many of these troops are stationed in these countries on the basis of bilateral treaties that are still secret, that are still confidential after 70 years after they were signed. So again, that gives you an idea of, we're not, even though we tend to speak of Europe and America as allies, we can see that there's an imbalance of power there. That's quite obvious. If you've got one of the two allies that essentially militarily occupies the other, and then of course there's a myriad of other ways in which the US continues to exercise huge influence over Europe. It has control of or it has a huge influence over the kind of intellectual ecosystem via its huge kind of archipelago of think tanks, media organizations, NGOs, and so on and so forth, that exercise a very powerful influence over the kind of the public debate, especially at the elite level. In Italy, so that's a very important in Europe. Sorry, so that's a very important point. More in general, of course, they've had long-standing, and they continue to have long-standing institutional linkages, especially I would say at the intelligence/security/military level, mostly via NATO. Again, NATO, an organization that is presented as this alliance of equals, when in fact it's rather obviously a kind of US-dominated organization that the US has used to maintain its control over Europe after the war, and even after the end of the Cold War, by constantly finding and inventing new enemies to justify NATO's continued existence. And then there is the crucial role of the European Union, which is usually seen as its counterbalance to American power. This is certainly how a lot of kind of starry-eyed leftists in Europe have often seen the European Union as a counterbalance to US power, and they've almost like attached this kind of anti-imperialist aspect to the European Union. In fact, the European Union is the exact opposite of that. The Americans were big promoters of the idea of European federalism and European integration in the post-war period. I think because they understood very well that having a kind of centralized system of power through which, by exercising their influence over which they would be able to exercise control over much of the continent without having to actually, exercise their influence over every single government. They saw that as being very effective, and in fact, it has been. Just look, and I think that has become very apparent. It was already to some of us at least, but I think it's becoming increasingly apparent during the Ukraine war, where we've seen the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, essentially speak as almost an American envoy, just going out of her way to ensure that all the member states in Europe would stay aligned and subordinated to the US NATO strategy. And I think that really reveals what the EU is all about. It's never been about Europe's emancipation from America. It's always, in fact, been one of the tools that the US has used to exercise its control over Europe. And so I think when you combine all these elements together, then you maybe start to understand why Europe is apparently incapable of acting rationally in its own self-interest, but seems to act in in the interest of other centers of power, i.e., Washington and NATO. And just finally, perhaps the most glaring example of that is the fact that everyone pretty much knows in Europe that whether directly or indirectly, the US is behind the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline. So for those that don't know, the Nord Stream pipeline is a pipeline because technically it still exists as a pipeline that connects Russia to Germany, and it was one of the pillars of Germany's economic success over the past 20 years. Well, that pipeline was bombed and put out of use in mid-2022, a few months after the beginning of the Russian invasion, and it's an open secret. And even the mainstream media has pretty much admitted it. It's an open secret that in one form or another, the US is clearly behind this, because the US is the actor that had the most to benefit from severing ties once and for all, even from a kind of symbolic standpoint, between Germany and Russia, and more in general Europe and Russia, by blowing up this pipeline, which really symbolized the growing interconnections between Europe, economic and energy interconnections between Europe and Russia in the I would say in the decade leading up to the Russia-Ukraine war. And not a single European leader, except for Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, who recently said, look, everyone knows America's behind this. Why is no one saying anything? No other European leader has said anything about this. There have been some investigations which have been, very swiftly closed without divulging any information about the conclusions they reached. And I think it's hard to imagine a better example of the level of, institutional, but also I would say psychological subordination of European elites to America, to the point where America can bomb a critical European infrastructure and no one in Europe will say anything about it. The media will cover it up, politicians will cover it up, the governments will cover it up, the intelligence and security services will cover it up, and the police will cover it up by, just not pursuing any investigation worthy of that name, which is what the European governments have done. So I think in part, there's your answer. So years of vassalization have bred a political class in Europe that is is of very poor quality. It's a very poor quality. From an intellectual and political standpoint, the vassals will be vassals. And if you've got an entire system that is designed to kind of block anyone that has Europe's strategic interests at heart from actually managing to climb up the political system, while you have a political system that promotes those that are willing to serve foreign interests, American interests, NATO interests, which is how the system is set up. Then you end up, that's the political elites that you end up with. And again, and I really will wrap it up here. There's another issue, and that is that via the European Union, governments have pretty much delegated much of what would be government competences in the economic sphere, in the monetary sphere, in the bureaucratic sphere, to the European Union. So now most of those decisions are taken in Brussels, where the European institutions are located, and in Frankfurt, where the European Central Bank is located. So all the major economic decisions, economic policy decisions, are taken there. They're not taken at the government level anymore. Again, you can see how that would have an impact. So, because what you've got is, you've bred a political class that for a very long time has not been accustomed to take high-stake decisions. Like, politics with a capital P is first and foremost economic policy, and that's been all delegated to the EU, and B, foreign policy and security and defense policy, but that has pretty much all been delegated to NATO. So you've got European governments that have essentially delegated all the major aspects of what is essentially politics and policy making to supranational and international institutions. And of course, that will breed, even if you don't want to believe that everyone is acting, all the politicians acting in bad faith, and they're part of some nefarious plan, a system of this kind will inevitably breed an infantilized political class, because you'll end up with politicians that think that politics is about ruling about minor secondary issues, urban planning issues and things of the sort, which of course are important, but politics with a capital P is something else. And here you have a political class that hasn't been accustomed to deal with politics with a capital P for a very long time. And this is how you end up in the mess that we're in now in Europe, I guess. Sorry for the long winding answer.
Yeah, it's great. So I have a question. One way that you put it in one of your articles was that what's going on is intra-Western economic cannibalization. And I think that's a pretty good way to put it. If Germany is the sort of powerhouse of Europe, it's losing its export market to China, it's losing its cheap raw materials from Russia because it's expected to play along with this new Cold War. It's basically being asked to commit suicide. And that's the way I see Europe as being asked to commit political economic suicide. And my question is, though, so the answer I'm getting from you is that the European elites are basically they're domesticated sort of house pets, and they've just sort of inhabited this idiotic technocratic space for so long that they don't even know how to act like a big boy anymore. And I guess I can see that. Europe is a totally depoliticized, the EU hobbles politics, it depoliticized everything. It's totally anti-democratic, totally technocratic. There's no sovereignty. No one's in charge of the currency. But so then the analysis basically comes down to these people are habituated into acting like, I think you said infantilizing, acting like fools or making mistakes. And I just wonder, can we disaggregate the groups and the nations a little bit more? So maybe there is a client oligarchy, or maybe there is like a comprador kind of element where there are probably, I don't know, I'm asking you, but maybe segments within countries in Europe which are actually benefiting, and I would wonder how that might work.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Well, I mean, if you look at the political elites, it's fairly obvious how they benefit from playing along with this system. So part of the problem with the internationalization and supranationalization, and I would say even privatization of politics, is that you've created this massive global kind of ecosystem where a politician's kind of lifespan is not limited to the national, well, kind of the political lifespan of national politicians is no longer limited to the national context. In fact, I would say the national context is nowadays seen more as a stepping stone towards, when your real career will begin, which is when you're kicked out of office by voters, which is something that you're not going to be concerned about because, unlike in the past, you don't see your political life as being something that you will entertain within that nation for your entire lifespan. But once you've finished in office, then there's a whole array of institutions, both public and private, international, supranational institutions that are ready to open their doors to you for very well-paid jobs, way better paid than whatever you were earning as a politician, especially if you have done your job as a comprador elite, basically. And so look at so it's not uncommon for national politicians in Europe to once they lose elections to go and work for European institutions. So you can almost see like a hierarchy, where you've got the national level at the bottom, and then after that you can work your way up to the European institutions, the supranational institutions. Then you've got the international institutions, like the IMF and so on and so forth, where a lot of these people also end up going to. And then after that, you've got the big financial institutions, which is probably where you make the most money, which is where a lot of people go and work for once they move out of the EU institutions. So almost, I've lost count of how many presidents of the European Commission, once they finished their mandate, have gone to work for some big Americans, not uncoincidentally, investment bank, mostly Goldman Sachs. There's a great deal of European commissioners that have gone and ended up working for Goldman Sachs once they finished their mandate. So I think this is, so this is one answer. So it's the financial sector. Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of these European commissioners will go and work for the financial sector. There are great many ties between, especially Goldman Sachs and the European political elites. Mario Monti, who was a kind of a technocrat that was essentially imposed on Italy in 2011 when the Berlusconi government fell. He came from Goldman Sachs. Mario Draghi had worked for Goldman Sachs as well, and Barroso and other European commissioners then went on to work for Goldman Sachs. So that's one part of the answer. So from a politician's perspective, you're no longer that worried about maintaining consensus as you would have been. And in fact, you have more to benefit in a way from just going along with the script while so of course you gotta play the part, why when you're in opposition, and then when you're trying to get elected, you'll make many a grand statement about all the good things you're going to do for your country. But once you get into power, then you got to play along with your with kind of what your international and supranational overlords expect from you if you want to enjoy a good career after that. So that's part of the problem which relates to this kind of supranationalization of politics. And then of course you've got economic sectors that have also benefited from this. So if you look at the European Union, so of course, I mean, the financial sector has obviously, even the European financial sector obviously benefits from this architecture, which is very much kind of, pro financial capital. The European Union is founded upon the idea of the free movement of capital, along with the free movement of labor. So free movement of labor, capital, and goods. These are the kind of the three pillars of the European Union, and of course, capital is always aimed at unshackling itself from the national level. And here you can see how the European Union really embodies this quintessential capitalist project, in a sense that it was founded on the idea of unshackling capital from any form of national control. So you can see why, for example, that sector, the financial sector of the economy, but big capital in general, benefits from this very much pro-capital institutional architecture. It's again, the European Union is very much geared towards an export-led economy. So if you're a big industry which relies or can afford to rely on exports, then having a system that essentially is very much designed to repress labor, to unshackle capital on one hand and repress labor on the other, keep wages down, destructure, kind of organized labor power, all things that the European Union, essentially is founded on in the treaties. If you're going to look at the treaties, I mean, they're a condensation of kind of neoliberal ideology. So again, if you're a big exporting company, you've got everything to benefit from a system that suppresses wages. Of course, that creates a problem for smaller companies that are dependent on the domestic economy, on internal demand, because people have less money to spend. So small and medium capital, in many respects, hasn't benefited so much from this system. In fact, if you look at Italy, I mean, it's pretty clear that if those sectors of the economy that depend on internal demand have suffered very much, and those tend to be smaller enterprises, smaller businesses. The big companies, the big industries that rely very much on exports, on the other hand, have benefited from this kind of institutional architecture. So there are clear segments of the economy that have benefited. I mean, the whole European Union project has been, as I said, a project of capital against labor, and then I would say big capital actually against labor and small and medium capital. And you can see that in a way it's driven processes of economic concentration in pretty much every sector. So yes, I mean, not everyone has lost out from this. Not everyone loses out from this, from the system. Not at all. And for a long time, big European businesses were able to, I would, to some degree, healthily compete with American businesses. But that has, and so if we look, for example, but that has engendered growing tensions, though, as the international context has changed to the degree that America is less and less able of imposing its economic will on countries, on using the exorbitant privilege of the dollar to pretty much survive without actually having an industrial base, which is what America has done for several decades. I think American elites understand very well that world is coming to an end. They're trying to fight against it. They're trying to slow down that process, but they realize it's happening. I mean, they're not complete idiots, and I think that's why we've seen these growing tensions between Europe and America and European businesses and American businesses. I mean, I think they first emerged under Trump. You remember Trump, who levied taxes on European car imports and other European imports. So we've been seen this growing struggle between European capital and American capital as America realizes the need to reindustrialize itself, and as it attempts at least to reindustrialize itself, European industry becomes much more of a competitor than it used to be in the past. And I think that explains what may seem counterproductive at first, like, why would you want to economically weaken your strongest ally, right? I mean, it doesn't seem to make sense at face value, but I think it does when you realize that America realizes its ability to, the American empire is shrinking. It's shrinking in terms of America's, the informal American empire, i.e. America's ability to impose its will, both militarily and economically, on pretty much the entire planet. That no longer exists. And so in that context, increasingly, the American empire is shrinking to to the so-called collective West. What is the American empire today, really? Not just, in actual terms, in substantive terms, I would say, not just, it's really, it's Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. It's NATO, basically. NATO, or, NATO plus, if you want. That's pretty much all that's left. And I think in this context of heightened, geopolitical tensions and America's heightened intensification of its attempts to maintain what's left of its global hegemony by slowing down the rise of China, Russia, and other powers. In this context, reaffirming your control over the vassals is quintessential. America can't afford to lose its protectorates in Europe and elsewhere. And so I think, now more than ever, it sees their economic weakening, even if it might hurt American businesses because, say, Europeans have less money to buy American products. They see that as a cost, as a price that is worth paying, both in terms of weakening kind of industrial competition from these countries, but also in terms of, by weakening these countries, we make them easier to control. We make them more willing to accept kind of American military an American military presence in those countries. For example, even if this goes against their kind of material self-interest, I think this is what. So in a way, a weakening Germany, for example, has been very important in terms of getting Germany on board with the U.S. NATO strategy in Ukraine, for example, and so we're seeing this intent, kind of a growing U.S. presence in all the in all the protectorates. So we're seeing the same thing in Asia, with Australia. We've seen the same attempts with Japan, South Korea. It's the same everywhere. And so as the US, militarizes its or remilitarizes its relations with pretty much the entire world, maintaining these forward bases is absolutely fundamental. So I think this also explains, yes, this changing relationship between the American elites and European elites and the elites of the kind of vassal states more in general.
I do have one question about big capital, which you said is not so tied to the fate of Europe or of the rest of Europe, I guess. Uh, you mentioned that Germany is deindustrializing. I think some of the biggest car manufacturers are announcing that they're shutting down factories and moving to the United States and China. I wonder what the real cost is to them doing that. I mean, I'm sure there is a cost to shutting down and setting up somewhere else. On the other hand, if you're a massive corporation, you can just do that. You can just move your capital to just withdraw your funds and put them somewhere else. And I guess the workers lose by getting laid off, and maybe the intermediary suppliers, the medium-sized businesses get the shaft as well. But the big capital in Europe, I don't see how, I can see how there's a cost to it, but I just wonder, are these even German interests that we're talking about? Or are they just shareholders of an international corporation that doesn't have any um, real connection to Europe?
Right. Well, I think first and foremost, like you can't, like when it comes to capital. So in a way, capital has always tried to unshackle itself from democratic control, which can only happen through the state. But at the same time, it can never completely separate itself from the state. So I think when people think of neoliberalism, they think of this idea of just the state withering out in favor of this all-powerful market, and that capital's ultimate dream is to do away with the state. And I think, in fact, neoliberalism shows us the capital, despite everything, very much needs the state. It needs the state to enforce the kind of the regulatory framework that allows capital to thrive. It needs the state to, kind of police and repress workers. It needs the state to open up new markets. It needs the state to even protect the general interests of capital, for example, via central bank monetary policy, et cetera, et cetera. So capital can never fully unshackle itself from the state. And and Germany is, I would say, maybe the part, in part along with France, one of the few countries that really can say that it has or has had in the past an elite that has kind of pursued the collective interests, at the very least, of capital, if not of workers, but via this collaboration between capital and the state. So just closing shop and moving somewhere else, I mean, it does entail huge costs. It does mean that you're severing. Basically, what you're doing is you're pulverizing. You're trying to destroy a power block, a national capitalist power block. And I think that is problematic even from the standpoint of capital. And yes, of course, if you've got tons of out of money, you can survive. But still, history is full of world wars have broken out because of intercapitalist conflicts. And I think what we're witnessing here is kind of an intra-Western intercapitalist conflict. So this is not something that very powerful segments of European big capital are taking lightly. I mean, they're really angry. They're pissed off. And I think so. And that's been really interesting to see, this divergence between what's the aspirations and the direction that the political class in Germany and other countries is pushing for, and what seem to be the demands and the aspirations of the capitalist class. So they historically, of course, they've tended to work in quite an aligned fashion, but now we're seeing a divergence almost. So you have Germany's political elites, for example, that in part would appear to want to go along with America's new Cold War with China by kind of delinking from China and antagonizing relations with China, because this is part of America's global desperate strategy for maintaining global hegemony. But at the same time, you've got big German businesses that are saying, we can't give up the Chinese market. Are you crazy? You've already crippled our profits by weaning off Russian gas. Now we're paying the gas 2, 3, 4 times more, buying it from America and other countries, and now you want us to give up on our biggest export market? Are you crazy? And so I think this is another interesting phenomenon that we're witnessing now. So there are clearly very strong internal conflicts even within the elites, even within the Western elites today. And I think in a way you witness the same thing in America to some extent as well. So capital, big capital tends to thrives off little conflicts in a way. It doesn't thrive from World War. In a way, no one wants that. No one. Capitalists don't want nuclear war with China. But you do seem to have sectors of the, what you could call the national security state, even sectors of the military-industrial complex, of course, that are pushing for escalating tensions wherever you look, basically, in Asia, in the Middle East, in Europe, obviously, vis-a-vis Russia, despite even sectors of the American capitalist class saying, we don't want this. We don't want to completely break off relations with China. We need China. Even interestingly, Wall Street and even American financial capital, in a way, is trying to push back against this increased push, towards all-out conflict with what are perceived by the national security state as existential threats to American hegemony. So again, the question becomes that who's really calling the shots now in the West, in the collective West, and even in America itself? It's not that clear. I think you've got quite strong tensions within the elites in America and in the West more in general. I think we'll see more of those tensions as the situation escalates in the next few months, I would say.
Thanks for talking to us today. I have a question about, I guess, the EU and the constraints it puts on the political class of the member countries. I was wondering what your thoughts were on the UK after Brexit. I mean, it seems like none of the doomsday prophecies kind of came true there, but at the same time, it also wasn't really a restorative thing for the UK, and a lot of the things people associated with the EU were just kind of the interests of the British political class. I mean, is it too soon to say? Has it been demoralizing for people? Yeah, I just wanted to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So a number of issues when it comes to Brexit. So first of all, I think Brexit was a fluke. Like, elites tend to have a pretty firm control of democratic and political processes in the West nowadays. I would say the control is almost absolute, to the point that I think it's kind of out of place to even talk of democracy from a substantive standpoint. In terms of what we have in the West today, we essentially have an oligarchy that is able to control the quote unquote democratic process, throughout, and to determine its outcomes to a very, very large degree in a number of ways, which we won't get into right now. But I think Brexit is kind of that exception. The British political class called for Brexit in a way to appease tensions, especially within the conservative camp, which was growing increasingly restless with the European Union. And so, it was an attempt to throw a bone at this growing kind of right-wing populist grievances that were emerging within the even within the Conservative Party itself. But they did it safe, almost I would say, sure in the knowledge that the referendum would not pass. I'm pretty convinced of this, because that's what all the polls showed, and they were like, come on. I mean, there's no way. As much as people might be, pissed off with the European Union, like, come on, they're not really going to vote to leave. I mean, I think they really, that's part of this kind of cognitive bubble that they live in. They within the kind of liberal conservative elite classes, the concept was of leaving the European Union was so unconceivable that they really didn't see it as a realistic option. And but it happened, because sometimes flukes happen in history. And so, and they didn't, and of course, as you mentioned, I mean, the British political class and British capitalist class had every interest in remaining within the European Union for the reasons we've discussed. So that, from a political standpoint, the European Union is very effective to the extent that it depoliticizes policymaking. So, kind of in a very simplistic manner, it's very helpful for political classes to say, oh, the European Union is asking us to do this. The European Union is asking us to pursue these kind of, anti-social, anti-labor policies. We're not the ones that want to do it, but we have to do it because this is what the European Union is demanding. I mean, this is kind of depoliticization 101. This is how it's kind of this blame shift where you create these external institutions which you can then blame for policies that you wanted to implement in the first place. Very effective, very effective. It's worked very well in really destructuring democratic politics in Europe. So this was a system that the British political class was more than happy to live with, within limits. I mean, British political class was smarter than the political class of other countries, for example, in retaining their monetary sovereignty by not joining the euro, for example. So Britain is also a country that enjoys a much higher degree, like being in the European Union is one thing. It means you're subject to, all those rules that I mentioned in terms of, free movement of capital, labor. You're subject to a lot of regulations that come from the European Union. But so long as you have your currency, you can still, you still have some relative autonomy to the extent that, management of the currency is basically the precondition for the implementation of any form of economic policy. So one thing has been in the European Union, and one thing has been in the euro. So once you lose your monetary sovereignty, then that's then you're done for. Basically, you have no economic sovereignty whatsoever. Basically, so UK was more sovereign than other countries, but again, but the British. Even the British capitalist class had every interest. The financial class, obviously, the city had every interest in being part of this, pro-financial capital union, which allows for the completely free movement of capital, financial capital across Europe. So the elites didn't want Brexit, but as I said, it happened, and so once it happened, then they went into damage control mode. So, and that means, okay, how do we solve this problem? So how do we retain all the benefits that we had prior to Brexit? And how do we avoid the risk of the repoliticization of domestic politics that Brexit potentially entails and allows for? So that was for example, my left-wing defense of Brexit was, I'm under no illusion that Brexit in itself will bring about the kind of structural pro-worker, pro-labor changes that we would like to see. but it widens the scope of the political action that is possible in that direction. So if you abandon an arrangement, an institutional arrangement that is structurally pro-capital and anti-labor, that means that you're not subject to a wide number of rules that really tie your hands. Which of course, they chose to tie their hands for the reason I mentioned, but your hands are effectively tied, which means that if an alternative universe in which Corbyn won the elections, he would have been subject. So you've got this radical left-wing government that miraculously manages to get into power, but he still, even that government would have been subject to the EU's rules or regulations in terms of the limits it places on state intervention in the economy, in terms of nationalization, state monopolies, and so on and so forth. So from a left-wing perspective, for me, it was a structural argument. Like, if you can widen the structural limits of what is possible in democratic politics, then that's a good thing, regardless of what the immediate fallout is. So, even if Brexit had in the short term, from my perspective, led to, say, even more right-wing, even more anti-labor policies, it still would have been something to support from a structural perspective, because time passes, and at some point we can then use those wider that wider space of maneuver that we've created for ourselves thanks to Brexit. So what we're seeing is not surprising at all from my perspective. I mean, it's just it's the British political class, it's the British elites trying to ensure that Brexit does not bring about a more democratic, a more participatory politics, but brings about the opposite. And so, for example, one of the things that the capital, of course, liked about capital in all countries, in all European countries, likes about the European Union, of course, is the free movement of labor, cheap labor, which means you can import labor from other EU countries and legally pay them less than you're required to pay domestic workers. But you can see why capitalists would like that. But the kind of influx of immigrants from the EU was one of the reasons for people's grievances with the European Union, because it did lead to a large influx of labor from lower wage countries. And this, in a number of British sectors, for example, and there are studies about this, I mean, they did push down wages. We can have a big discussion about immigration, but that's a fact, and so, like, these grievances weren't born out of nowhere. They weren't born out of an innate racism of the British people. I mean, they were raising legitimate concerns about the impact of some of these policies. So once the British political class can't import low wage labor from the European Union anymore, it decides to massively increase the import of labor from extra EU countries, which is what we've seen. And this is just one of the many examples in which they basically tried to recreate what they had within the European Union outside of the European Union. So what you have today is essentially, what you could call, what some people called, Breno, Brexit in name only. De facto, what you have is exactly the very much a similar system in place without the European Union there. And so I think the bottom line is, leaving these structures and institutions in itself isn't a solution, but it is a precondition for the pursuit of more radical, emancipatory, democratic, pro-worker, pro-labor policies. This is the kind of the fundamental point that a lot of people on the left, even in Europe, really fail to acknowledge. Despite our best efforts to try to get them to understand what the EU is all about. And of course, Brexit hasn't helped in this regard, because they now they can point to Brexit and say, oh, you see, Now you've got race riots, and that's because of Brexit. Of course, it has nothing to do with Brexit. But clearly it hasn't helped. The way the British elites have been very skillful in outmaneuvering Brexit definitely hasn't helped the cause of those of us who are fighting for greater national democratic sovereignty in Europe, for sure.
So I have a kind of I guess a comment on the impression that I'm getting, and I was just wondering maybe to get your take on it, and then another question, sort of my final one, I guess. So the impression I'm getting is, it's basically impossible for the populations in Europe to advocate their sort of concrete geopolitical economic interests so long as they have these institutions which they've historically inherited from the post-war moment. And we say, okay, why? Well, we might say that the EU has always been this pro-capitalist institution, but it's always been a specific kind of capitalist institution. It's always been, it was useful for a moment in the post-war situation, so long as Soviet Union existed, so long as China was the way that it was. And it was a net exporting economy. And if you look, so, you export more than you import, cars, whatever. And, Maastricht says you can only run a 2% of GDP deficit. No world power can run without its own currency and only have a 2% of GDP deficit. So, I mean, it seems to me that all of these institutions that sort of developed out of that moment that seems to be ending now, these institutions positively inhibit the people who occupy the European landmass from being able to advocate their own interests. Like it is a straitjacket. And so if there was a mistake, like if the European comprador client oligarchy elites, if they're making a mistake, it's this moment where they say, why would they do this to us? Why would they do this to their friends? I mean, Europe was never a friend. They were a lackey. They were useful. And now, as you said, the left in Europe is so fundamentally sort of pumped full of neoliberal nonsense that it just loves this stuff. There's not even anybody to go to criticize it. So I just wonder, like, does that check out with you? And then what do you think about so the rising right-wing movements and the sort of non-left neoliberal left movements like Bündnisser Wagenknecht, or these things in France which are trying to stem the right-wing stuff? Like, how do we understand those things in this context?
Right, yeah. So in terms of the first question, I think it's important to understand that I think the European Union, and especially the Euro, was always much more of a political project than an economic project. Even though it's always been presented as this fundamentally economic project. I think its goals were first and foremost political. I think the European Union has to be understood as a fundamentally anti-democratic project. I think this was the driving force. It was about depoliticizing politics. It's not a coincidence that you see this big push towards supranational organization towards the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s, because that's in a way that came on the heels of the greatest moment of class conflict in Europe, where the kind of the post-war arrangement had created a situation where the full employment regime had strengthened workers, had strengthened mass politics, had strengthened democratic politics to such an extent that capital really saw a threat to its continued existence, at least in a way, in the form that it had known until then. So I think they saw a real risk of capitalism almost being democratically transcended at some point. I mean, they had an existential fear of losing their own privileges, which they continue to enjoy even within this kind of late class, capital labor compromise that emerged from post-war arrangement, in the sense that compromise was risked no longer existing as the power of labor kept increasing. And that's when we start witnessing this push towards supranational integration as a way of essentially solving these domestic issues that national elites didn't know how to solve. And so one of the solutions was depoliticizing the democratic process, the decision-making process, by making it less democratic, by transferring these powers to these supranational organizations, where the decision-making process would be effectively insulated from kind of popular democratic pressures. So this is quite so. I think the neoliberal project, more in general, can be understood in these terms as first and foremost a political project. A political project, I think, where reestablishing kind of capitalist dominance even came before the pursuit of profit. So I think within neoliberalism, I think business is ready to accept lower profits than it may be. So if you consider austerity, for example. So from a strictly capitalist perspective, austerity doesn't make that much sense. I mean, you're literally making people poorer, which means they have less money to buy stuff. So it's not immediately clear, and it clearly hasn't. It doesn't boost the profit rate. I mean, in fact, we've seen profit rate in Europe in many ways for many sectors fall as a result of austerity, especially those sectors that are reliant on domestic demand. But those policies do allow you to maintain your control over the populace. So making people poorer, yes, it means they have less money to buy your stuff, but it also means they have less political power. And so you maintain your political power even at the cost of maybe losing a bit of your profit margin. This is kind of how I view the neoliberal project in general, and the European Union project more specifically. And I think what we're witnessing now is basically the kind of the unraveling of that project. I mean, you've created a situation where it's you've created a situation where the economy is unable to function to such an extent that you've got increased social unrest. But then again, that's containing that was the whole reason the system was designed, and so now the system can only double down on the repressive measures. It can only double down on the kind of hollowing out of the democratic processes. But that in itself, by doubling down on that, it also means that you keep worsening the social and economic situation of the masses, so you've really this vicious circle, I think, which can only last that long. I think, and in terms of, and it's also now starting to create a problem, I think, even for those national elites that for a long time had benefited from this system. Notwithstanding what I said earlier about the fact that yes, they can always go and find a job somewhere else, but at the same time, clearly formal democratic politics is collapsing in a way that does make it problematic, even for national elites. You've got these, if you take a country like Italy, you've got these increasingly shortened political cycles where a government comes into power promising to do, X, Y, and Z to make things better for people. It isn't allowed to do that because of the constraints of the system. This engenders, populist uprisings in one form or another, which, lead the government in power to fall. A new government comes in, maybe under populist pretenses, but that government is also unable to solve the problems because of the constraints that we mentioned. And so you've got these shortened political cycles, what you could call a political cycle of depoliticization. So you've really got this unraveling of the system, and the system itself, I think, really doesn't have the means to adequately respond to that. For now, it's responding purely through repressive measures, unprecedented restraints on free speech, For example, you've got this, hyper censorious regime that has been rolled out in, throughout the European Union. So that's one aspect, and and in terms of actual popular opposition, there isn't much out there, which is the really depressing aspect of all this. I think part of it has to do with the fact that there's, especially on the left, there's always been an underappreciation of sort of the extent to which the EU represents a problem for radical politics. And so this is why all attempts or all kind of left-wing populist phenomena that we've witnessed over the past 10, 15 years, Syriza in Greece or Podemos in Spain, to some degree, even though it's not your classic kind of left-wing populist party, the Five Star Movement in Italy, all these experiments failed because they failed to acknowledge the nature of the European Union. They thought they could operate within those constraints without realizing that those constraints are there precisely to impede the kind of politics that those parties wanted to implement. Look at Syriza, elected on an anti-austerity platform, hoping that they could, convince the European Union to reverse those policies, and in the end, they're forced to accept an even harsher version of the austerity policies that they were elected to fight against. And you've got countless examples of that. And so, yes, I mean, the lack of appreciation for the true nature of the European Union on the European left has been a huge problem. Something I've written about a lot. There are deep-seated, historical reasons for that as well. But the end result is that all those experiments have been reabsorbed into the system, and that also breeds disillusion, of course. And then you have the right-wing populists, which, notwithstanding the fact that, regardless of, whether one likes their politics or not, I mean, what's important from the perspective of this argument is that they have the same problem of the populist left. Even the populist right fails to appreciate the constraints of the European Union. In fact, they pretty much all accept those constraints. Like, you've got no major right-wing populist party, these nationalist or neo-fascist parties, who that openly opposes the European Union or the euro, which is incredible because this is a big change. But even just 10 years ago, most of those parties, like, the AfD and other parties, the AfD is the kind of far right party in Germany that made big wins in the recent election. They all ran on anti-Euro platforms and anti-EU platforms for a very long time. But as they get closer and closer to power, they start to soften their tones, because I think in a way they realize that if you want to, the only way look at Le Pen. Le Pen used to be rabidly anti-Euro. She ran on an anti-Euro platform. Not, in the last, two elections ago, she ran on a radical anti-Euro platform. Now she's, she's accepted to operate with, now she's a she's a critical pro-European, and many other examples. And so I think they realize that, if you want to get into power, you have to accept those constraints. But the paradox is that, that also means that once you get into power, you won't be able to do much. So, I mean, how do you get out of this paradox? It's not clear. I mean, the question then becomes, is there a way of democratically opting out of this regime? Very hard, very, very hard. Because, first of all, you would need a political leadership that is ready to engage in very, very high stake politics, because, unilaterally exiting not just the European Union, but especially the euro is not easy. I mean, I think it can be done. And, even technically, this is something that I've looked at a lot. I mean, currency regimes and currency unions have broken up in the past. Think of when the Soviet Union broke up. Countries had to launch national currencies almost overnight without all the the technical gimmicks that we have now, where money is mostly electronic, which would make that transition much easier than actually physically having to print banknotes, which is what a lot of countries had to do in in 91. But it does require a political class that is ready to engage in very, very high stake politics, and you don't see that anymore. I mean, this means that you're having to take decisions of really kind of in a way, life or death, and you got to take responsibility for that. It's not like and so that relates to what I was saying earlier. I mean, this is why Syriza in Greece, for example, never really considered dropping out of the euro, because they just weren't psychologically ready for that level of politics. Which historically politics has always been and is about, dealing with very, very high stakes. And I think, up until the 70s and 80s, the European political class was an old school political class that understood that. Now we don't have that anymore. So that's one of the problems. And then there's also the problem that how do you even get elected in the first place if you're running on a platform that will see all the entire establishment media mobilize against you in order not to get you elected. Something, what happened to Corbyn in the UK, for example, even though, different context. So that remains an open question. I think the only answer in the short term that I can see to that is, well, we have to start building a politics of truth. So until we start telling the truth about the European Union and the euro, we're not going to get anywhere. We're just telling ourselves, fairy tale stories about what we can do within this system, which is very little. And there are very few positive stories. And the Sarah Wagenknecht's party in Germany that you mentioned, I would say that's the only kind of left populist party in Europe today that gets this right. And I think that has really jettisoned the kind of left-wing neoliberal politics that has dominated Europe for so long, and embraced a new form of I would say popular, if not populist, left-wing politics, class-based politics. By rejecting kind of neoliberal paradigm, the progressive neoliberal paradigm, and also by, being very open about, the problem represented by the European Union and the euro, and even speaking openly about, Europe's geopolitical challenges and the need to reestablish relations with Russia and so on and so forth. I would say it's the only party in Europe today that gets it right. And then you've got some a very limited number of governments that are at least within the system trying to kind of push back against kind of EU encroachment on national sovereignty, and against the kind of NATOization of Europe and this push towards all-out war with Russia. And namely, it's Orban in Hungary. So clearly, right-wing politician who, most on the left consider to be, the devil himself. But when it comes to pushing back against EU encroachment, and especially when it comes to pushing back against, kind of the dragging of Europe into the proxy war with Russia, he's one of the few very outspoken politicians who is doing that. And then you've got a smaller example, which is the Slovakian Prime Minister Fico, who suffered a failed attempt on his life not too long ago. Also, strong critic of the European Union, strong opponent of NATO. But these are very, very limited examples, and I think it's interesting to note that Hungary, I think, is able to take this stance. Well, because it has an adult political class and an actual statesman, an actual political leader whose ideas one may disagree with or not. But that's what politics should look like in terms of what the risks you're ready to take. And also, Hungary is not in the euro, so that also helps a lot in a sense that the EU's ability to use monetary and financial forms of pressure on that country are much more limited than they would be if that country had the euro. So if Hungary had the euro, I think Orban would have been out of the game a very long time ago, because the EU would simply have engineered a financial crisis in the country and would have really kind of forced the government to collapse. Because Hungary has its own currency, it can't do that. And once again, we're reminded of the importance of not giving up your currency, because that still means that you have some degree of maneuver, even of opposing EU politics from within the European Union. If you have the euro, that's simply impossible. And I think if Le Pen had won in France, we would have seen that play out very well. One of the most powerful countries in Europe. If they, and you've got this radical nationalist coming to power, one of the most powerful countries in Europe, surely they would be able to change things from within. I think not. I think not, because we saw the European Union already apply forms of financial pressure on France prior to the elections, precisely in order to scare people off from voting for Le Pen. So we already saw the European Union kind of meddle in the French elections by essentially what the European Central Bank did in that case was when there was a sell-off French bonds, which sent interest rates up, which was covered in the press as this, just a taste of the financial disaster that France would face if Le Pen were to win the elections. The European Central Bank could have stopped that immediately just by intervening in the French bond market. It could have brought interest rates down, could have stopped the panic. It didn't do it, and I think that was a deliberate choice not to intervene. Just one example of the many ways in which the European Union is able to influence the democratic process in those countries that have the euro, because all you need to do is to manipulate the bond markets a bit, and you create a financial panic, which is then used to scapegoat whatever party you don't want that they get into power. So yeah, this is kind of where we're at.
I'm in America, and the one frustration I always run into, or the one roadblock I always run into talking politics with people, is when I say that I don't support either the Democratic or Republican Party. People's responses tend to be like, well, you don't have another choice. It's got to be one or the other. And I'm in Greece right now, and some of my friends are asking me what I think of Kasselakis, the current leader of Syriza. And I'm running into the same issue now, sort of explaining that the only sort of politics I could possibly imagine supporting is one that sees a way out of the euro and the European Union. And I think I'm okay with being on the margins of politics, because I just don't see how else things could possibly improve here. So I think, I mean, it is important to be sober about how far away, how far off that possibility is. And even if current populist Eurosceptic movements are on the rise, they're still a good way away from power. It's possible that massive geopolitical forces beyond anyone's control could change the landscape. We're currently witnessing de-dollarization. I don't know how the Ukraine conflict is going to resolve itself, and we have increasing disruption in the Middle East. So possibly that could change the landscape somehow to weaken European institutions, but even that is, at this stage and this point in time, I think very hard to see. Daniel?
Yeah, I'll just say thanks a lot for talking to us. We really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation. And maybe I don't know, just a thought I'll throw out there. Maybe we can't anticipate the way things are going to change because it's not an option that's disposable, that's at our disposal sort of in advance. I suspect that the way things are looking, there will be some big disruption which will force everything to change in a way which we didn't foresee and isn't convenient. But be curious to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks again.
Zach?
Oh, no thoughts. Just thank you for your time. That was a good conversation. Really enjoyed talking to you.
And do you have any closing thoughts, Thomas?
Yeah, well, first of all, yeah, thanks again. It was really great talking to you guys as well. I think there are reasons to be well, first thing I would say is that we need to find a way of relaunching radical anti-EU and anti-Euro politics, I think, in Europe. I think it's paradoxical that today, at a time when the European Union is proven to be more damaging and more dangerous than ever, Eurosceptic, especially left Eurosceptic politics, is at an all-time low. Because now what we have is not only do we see the European Union continuing to be very, extremely problematic from an economic and social perspective. So all the problems that we've been criticized, that we've been talking about, that we've been raising about the European Union and the constraints it places on emancipatory politics are still there. We see that in the return of austerity. So now we're going to see more attacks on the welfare state, more attacks on labor. That's already happening.